Imagine a world where the air feels heavy, where the streets echo not with laughter but with the cries of the dying. Imagine opening your door and finding your neighbour, healthy yesterday, lying cold, covered in strange black swellings. A world where priests refuse to perform last rites, where parents abandon their own children, and where entire villages vanish, as if swallowed by the earth itself. This is not the plot of a horror movie. This is not a legend or a myth. This was Europe in the mid-14th century, between the years 1347 and 1351. A silent enemy swept across the continent. It did not come with swords or cannons. It came with fleas. It came with rats. It came with something so small it could not even be seen, a bacterium that the world would later call Yersinia pestis. This was the Black Death, a plague so devastating that it wiped out nearly half of Europe's population in just a few short years. No war, no famine, no disaster in recorded history had ever matched its scale. But the Black Death was more than a wave of death. It was a force of transformation. It tore apart the old ways of life, crushed economies, shattered faith in religion, and in its ashes, it planted the seeds of a new Europe. Today, we journey back into the heart of the 14th century. We will uncover how the plague arrived, how it spread, and how it forever changed the destiny of Europe. This is the story of the Black Death, how the plague changed Europe forever. Europe before the plague. To understand the destruction that followed, we must first step into Europe just before the plague. It was the early 1300s, and Europe was not at its strongest. Yes, magnificent cathedrals rose into the skies, cities bustled with trade, and kings waged wars for power. But beneath the surface, Europe was fragile. The population had been growing steadily for centuries. Fields were overworked, food supplies stretched thin, and poverty was common. Peasants lived in cramped huts, often sharing space with animals. Clean water was scarce, and waste filled the streets of towns. And then came the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. Years of bad weather destroyed crops, leaving millions hungry. Weakened by hunger, people were more vulnerable to disease. The stage was set for disaster, but no one could have imagined what was coming, a darkness unlike any before. The origins, a death from the east. The story of the Black Death does not begin in Europe. Its origins lie far to the east, on the steppes of Central Asia. Historians believe the plague first emerged around the 1330s in the region of modern-day Mongolia. It spread along the great trade routes of the world, the Silk Road. Merchants carried goods, spices and silks, but unknowingly they also carried death. By the late 1340s, caravans and ships travelling westward brought the plague closer and closer to Europe. The perfect carriers were rats, creatures that lived in every ship, every market, every town. And on those rats lived fleas, thirsty for blood. These fleas carried the deadly bacterium, and with a single bite, they passed it to humans. One of the first dramatic outbreaks occurred in Kaffa, a Genoese trading port on the Black Sea. In 1346, the city was under siege by Mongol forces. But then something terrifying happened. The besieging army began to die in huge numbers from a mysterious illness. According to some accounts, the Mongols resorted to a gruesome tactic. They hurled the corpses of plague victims over the city walls, infecting those inside. Whether this detail is fact or legend, one thing is certain: ships fleeing Kaffa carried the plague into Europe. 1347. The plague reaches Europe. The year was 1347. In October, 12 ships from the Black Sea arrived at the bustling port of Messina, in Sicily. What awaited the townspeople was like a vision of hell. The sailors were already dying. Their bodies were covered in black boils, oozing blood and pus. Many were already dead before the ships even docked. The terrified people of Messina quickly drove the ships away, but it was too late. The plague had landed. From Sicily, the plague spread like wildfire. It leapt from port to port: Marseille, Genoa, Venice. Wherever ships arrived, death followed. By the spring of 1348, the plague had entered mainland Italy and France. By 1349, it reached England. Within just a few years, almost all of Europe was in its grip. What the plague looked like. To truly grasp the terror, we must understand what the plague did to its victims. There were three main forms of plague. Bubonic plague, the most common. Victims developed painful swellings called buboes in the groin, armpits, and neck. These turned black, giving the plague its name, septicemic plague. This form infected the blood. Victims bled under their skin, turning patches of the body dark purple or black. Death often came within a single day. Pneumonic plague, the deadliest of all. It infected the lungs and spread from person to person through the air. Victims coughed blood and died within days. Imagine a world where no one knew what germs were. No one knew about bacteria or viruses. Doctors wore long robes and strange beaked masks stuffed with herbs, hoping to protect themselves from what they believed were bad airs. But their remedies, bleeding, charms, prayers did nothing. The plague was unstoppable. The human toll, the numbers are staggering. Historians estimate that between 25 and 50 million people died in Europe alone. That was nearly 1 in every 2 people. Entire villages were wiped out. In some towns, the dead outnumbered the living. Corpses piled in the streets. Churchyards overflowed and mass graves were dug. Chroniclers of the time wrote scenes of horror. Parents abandoning their children, husbands leaving wives, priests refusing to visit the sick for fear of infection. Fear ruled the land. Some turned to religion, whipping themselves in public as a sign of repentance. Others gave in to despair, indulging in drinking, gambling, and sin, believing the end was near. The world as people knew it was collapsing. Fear, rumors, and scapegoats. In times of fear, people seek someone to blame, and during the plague, suspicion fell on outsiders. Rumors spread that the disease was caused by poisoned wells. Minority groups, especially Jews, were accused of spreading the plague. Across Europe, Jewish communities were attacked, massacred, or driven from towns. It was a dark chapter of human cruelty, showing how fear can breed violence. The plague moves north by 1348. The plague was marching northward. It reached Paris, killing tens of thousands. In England, it arrived at the port of Melcombe Regis and soon spread through London. The great city fell silent. Shops closed. The courts stopped functioning. Even the king, Edward III, fled in fear. By 1350, the plague crossed into Scandinavia. Norway, Sweden, Denmark all felt its touch. Even the icy north could not escape death. By 1351, Europe was unrecognizable. Fields lay abandoned. Church bells tolled endlessly. Half of the population was gone. But while the plague had brought unimaginable death, it also planted the seeds of change. Because from the ashes of destruction, a new Europe was about to rise. A Europe where old systems collapsed, where power shifted, and where the course of history was forever altered. By the year 1351, Europe was a graveyard. From Italy to England, from France to Germany, from Spain to Scandinavia, the Black Death had claimed tens of millions of lives. Entire families were gone. Whole villages were left empty, their houses collapsing into the earth. Travellers wrote of riding for miles without meeting a single soul. Europe was wounded, but what came next was not only recovery, it was transformation. The Black Death had not simply killed people, it had destroyed the very foundations of medieval society, and in the ruins, something new began to grow. Before the plague, medieval Europe ran on the system of feudalism. Peasants worked the land for their lords, and in return, they received protection and a share of the harvest. But when the plague wiped out nearly half the workforce, this system cracked. Fields lay untended, crops rotted. Lords who once held power suddenly faced shortages of labour. For the first time in centuries, peasants held the advantage. Imagine you are a peasant in the year 1352. Before the plague, your labour was cheap. Your lord could easily replace you. But now there are not enough peasants left. Suddenly your work is valuable. Landowners must compete for your labour. They offer higher wages, better conditions, and sometimes even freedom from feudal obligations. This shift was revolutionary. For the first time, ordinary workers had leverage. The rigid class structure of the Middle Ages began to weaken. In England, this led to dramatic changes. The Statute of Labourers was passed by King Edward III, attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, but it failed. People simply refused to work for less. This struggle between peasants and rulers would erupt again and again in the coming decades, leading to uprisings like the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. The Black Death had given birth to a new social power, the working class. Perhaps no institution was shaken more deeply than the Catholic Church. Before the plague, the church was the central pillar of medieval life. It claimed to hold the keys to salvation. Its priests, monks, and bishops were seen as spiritual guides. But during the plague, the church failed. Priests fled their parishes. Monasteries were devastated as monks died in huge numbers. Prayers, pilgrimages, and holy relics all proved powerless against the disease. For many, this was a crisis of faith. How could an all-powerful God allow such suffering? How could his representatives be so helpless? Doubt spread. Confidence in the church's authority began to crumble. This loss of faith would not disappear. It would smoulder for generations, eventually fueling movements like the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. The plague, in many ways, was the first crack in the church's iron grip on Europe. In medicine, too, the plague left its mark. In the 14th century, people did not know about bacteria or viruses. Doctors still believed in the ancient theory of the four humours. Illness, they thought, came from imbalances in blood, phlegm, black bile and yellow bile. During the plague, strange remedies were tried: bloodletting, burning herbs, bathing in vinegar, carrying posies of flowers to ward off bad air. Most of these did nothing, but the sheer failure of medieval medicine sparked a slow change. By the 15th and 16th centuries, scholars began to question old traditions. They performed dissections, studied anatomy, and sought natural, not just spiritual, causes of disease. The Black Death, by exposing the weakness of traditional medicine, set Europe on a path toward modern science. The economic impact of the Black Death was enormous. With fewer people, demand for food dropped. Grain prices fell, but wages for labourers rose. Landowners struggled to maintain their estates, and many went bankrupt. This shift redistributed wealth. Some peasants became landowners themselves. Merchants and townspeople gained power as trade eventually revived. The plague had torn apart the feudal economy and made way for a more flexible, money-based system. In the long run, this shift fueled the rise of a new middle class: traders, artisans, bankers, who would later drive the Renaissance. The psychological scars of the plague ran deep. Art and literature turned darker. Paintings showed skeletons, graves, and the figure of death itself. The famous motif of the Danse Macabre, the Dance of Death, appeared across Europe, reminding everyone that death spared no one, king or peasant. At the same time, survivors developed a new hunger for life. If death can strike at any moment, they thought, why not live fully? This new outlook contributed to the cultural flowering of the Renaissance, with its emphasis on human experience, beauty, and achievement. The Black Death had changed not just society, but the very way people thought about existence. After the plague ended in the early 1350s, Europe was not immediately healed. The disease returned again and again in smaller waves throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. Population growth was slow. It took nearly 150 years for Europe to regain the numbers it had before the plague, but this smaller population had unexpected benefits. With fewer mouths to feed, resources stretched further. Survivors enjoyed better diets, higher wages, and in many cases improved living standards. What had been a catastrophe also laid the groundwork for a healthier, stronger Europe. Out of death came rebirth. The economic, social, and cultural changes after the Black Death prepared the way for the Renaissance, the great flowering of art, science, and thought in the 15th and 16th centuries. The collapse of old systems freed people to question, to innovate, to imagine. Wealth concentrated in new hands, funding artists like Leonardo da Vinci and thinkers like Galileo. In a strange twist of fate, the plague that had nearly destroyed Europe also helped to create the modern world. The Black Death was not just a European story, it reshaped the world. Trade networks collapsed temporarily but were rebuilt stronger. Ideas about medicine, religion, and society shifted across continents. Even centuries later, memories of the plague haunted Europe, influencing policies, health systems, and cultural fears. And perhaps most importantly, it taught a lesson. Human societies are fragile. A tiny organism, invisible to the eye, can bring kingdoms to their knees. The Black Death remains one of the darkest chapters in human history. It killed without mercy, rich and poor, young and old. It spread terror and despair across an entire continent. But it also changed the course of history. It broke old systems of power. It reshaped economies and societies. It weakened the authority of the church. And it gave rise to new ways of thinking, ways that would eventually lead to the modern age. The plague was both a destroyer and a creator. From its shadows emerged a new Europe, forever transformed. And that is why, even centuries later, we remember it not only as a tragedy, but as a turning point. The moment when death swept across a continent and changed the world forever.